been entering the last few years into a kind of a renewed awareness of the dignity and the importance of rural church. And I wonder might God be opening a new chapter now? Might God be doing a new thing in rural places? And so we have the privilege of being a part of that.
Welcome back to the Rural Renewal Podcast. We are so glad that you have joined us today. Chris, we had a conversation earlier today about as pastors having relationships with other pastors in other churches. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, and I think the conversation was mostly that how it is very valuable to find other pastoral relationships that can work. I think there's for us, we have a bunch of pastors that we've built relationships with over the years, but particularly we have one family that we've been quite close with now for going on the better part of 10 years. And we have found it to be incredibly helpful for us, for our kids, to have just found some people we can kind of share in ministry with. It has been it becomes, there's just a lot of things from it, I think, from a pastoral standpoint that can really be helpful. And I mean, they happen to be within our own tradition. They're American Baptists like we are, although certainly we have pastoral relationships with people outside of our tradition as well, and those can be very helpful. But in this case, it's been, it's someone you can. It is hard to find friendships, at least in the total classic sense of the word. I think inside a community, there's a lot of people in Londonderry I think we're both friends with, and I would say that in the full sense of the word too. Right? We can talk to them about things. We can be real people with them. Pastors who even have some flaws. I know that's hard to believe, but we actually do. But it is. But there is something nice and something a little bit different about having a pastor another pastor and a spouse or family that you can have a relationship with. For us, it's worked out really well because our kids have also been able to be friends with their kids, and actually in some ways has been just as beneficial for our kids, maybe even more for our kids than it has for us at times. That's been really beautiful to see. We did talk a little bit about a couple of things that are probably helpful in terms of who you might look for in that sort of setting. So Kathleen, what were a couple of things that we talked about that we thought might be helpful in that regard?
Oh goodness! Now I'm forgetting.
Sorry,
what we
I'm not trying to put you on the spot. This isn't me trying to play got you. Gotcha is always a bad idea as a spouse.
Yeah.
We talked a little bit about distance and things like that.
Oh yeah. So our friends, they live about 35 minutes from us. So I think there isn't
and there's a mountain. There's a mountain between us.
Yeah, it's a little bit tricky, especially in the winter. But I think because there's a little bit of a distance, there's not people aren't checking out their church and checking out our church and trying to figure out which church they're going to go to. We're just too far from each other. And so we don't have that. I mean, you can be in the same community and be able to have good relationships, but for us, that's been nice that's not on the table in our relationship. We don't have to think about that. And our churches have done things together in the past, and we continue to do things together. So I think that's helpful. We're doing a whole dinner thing. We have dinner with them once a month, and I think it's a little bit tricky as our kids have gotten older and trying to keep to that once a month. But I think that's been really helpful. I don't remember the second thing that. Oh no, that
was the thing I had in mind. So if there was a second thing, it's been forgotten into the ether. But no, what I do, it has. The part about the distance and for us, one of the reasons, like I said, the reason I mentioned the mountain was because in our sense, in general, the people you would think of who would probably visit or come to our church, kind of they're not just from our town, but there's places you have to go where you drive over a mountain, and essentially, if you got to drive over a mountain, generally you're not going to do that. So in that regard, it feels like we're not necessarily, and I think that could work where people could potentially go to either church, but there is something nice about it. In some ways, it's nice because it's been good for us. We get to know some people in their church because we show up at church things there. They show up at church things at our church sometimes, which has been nice. It has led to our churches being able to do some things, particularly the youth in our churches being able to do some things together, which has been really nice. And again, you don't have, these are not necessary relationships, but it's something worth trying to seek out if you don't have that kind of relationship, because for us, we've just found it to be a real source of strength and comfort over the years, in a place where we're able to be there for them as friends, not as pastors. I mean, which is very similar, but also different. And something that I think we all kind of need a little bit of that in our life. And oftentimes, when you pastor, I mean, you end up, you lose, not entirely lose touch, but you often are losing touch with people that you grew up with and things like that, for longtime friends. So to have someone that you can kind of have that relationship with over time is really helpful. They could probably be further away. It works out well for us, especially where we're at in life with kiddos and stuff, that we are close enough together that we can do like dinner once a month. But yeah. It's worth the time. We also have a couple, and I would say this is not, I mean, it's very specifically for pastors helpful, but we have some people in our church who have really good relationships with other people, other Christians who go to different churches. I actually think that's really healthy as well. I know everybody kind of would like to go to church with their close friends. And there is obviously, hopefully you like the people you go to church with. If you don't, Jesus is working on at least teaching you how to love them. But hopefully you like them as well. But there is, I think there is some value in that as well. And we've seen that work for a few people in our church, that they have really close friends who are very strong believers and who they share a lot in their faith about, but who don't necessarily go to the same church. And in many ways, that's a source of strength as well. And so I wouldn't shy away from those kinds of things. I think, not that maybe anybody is, but I think it's worth just seeing that, and that we can really gain a lot of relationship value out of something like that. God can do a lot of neat stuff with that. We can learn. I think we learn a little bit about who we are, who our churches are as well, and how to relate to them.
I think that's great. Today on the podcast, we have Brad Roth, who wrote the book, God's Country, Faith, Hope, and the Future of the Rural Church. We were so excited that he said yes to this interview. It was such a delight to talk to him today.
Yep. And so we're looking forward to the interview. And the book's well worth grabbing. If you haven't, if you just want to read a book that really makes you think in a loving way about the rural church and about rural communities and how to love them, and to feel inspired about what they can be and what God might be doing in them, the book is pick up the book. It's well worth reading.
Today, we are welcoming Brad Roth. Brad wrote a book called God's Country, Faith, Hope, and the Future of the Rural Church. Brad, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, thanks, Chris and Kathleen, so much for this invitation. It's great to join you. And yeah, I grew up on a farm in rural central Illinois and kind of followed the track that a lot of kids did, and took off for college trying to get away from that farm, but have found myself back in rural communities. But yeah, I'm serving in central Kansas and have a wife and 3 sons kind of across the age range, and just really love the rural church, and am excited about anybody, anytime that's highlighting what God is doing in his rural communities.
Yeah, thanks. And like I said, that's something I really appreciated about finding your book and having a chance to read it. Just that comes through the excitement for the rural church, and some of the ways that you just talk about and think about the rural church, just so helpful for in our own perspective, or at least in my perspective, I would say from where we are here in southern Vermont, which isn't quite as farming as certainly as Kansas or Illinois would have been. But although there's certainly plenty of people who, but very much, skiing and things like that, all that, but a lot of those rural connections, still there. So really appreciate that. So how did you end up serving in rural places? Like, obviously you said, like, you kind of did went to the city, did school, things like that, and then ended up back in rural. How did God kind of bring that about in your life?
Yeah, well, from my perspective, it was totally accidental. And I guess from God's, it was providential. I didn't really want to be the rural church guy. I just wanted to serve God in the church, and kind of ended up in this. I mean, so I started off, that was my background, small town, farm, all of that. But, made my way through the city for school, and was kind of at a mid-sized city in Elkhart, Indiana. And then my first church was out in rural Eastern Washington. And that's really where it kind of like I started to think about this a little bit. I just was like, what is what's the unique genius of rural? Like, what is different about this? Because a lot of the stuff that I had learned in seminary it wasn't that it wasn't helpful, but it just didn't fit in the same way as I had imagined it would when I was, reading books about churches that were thriving in the suburbs of the city. And we after Washington State, we served little churches out in rural Peru, and now we are in rural Kansas. And really, I think the seed started to germinate for writing a book when we were here in Kansas, because I kept hearing that rural is fallen apart, that the brightest thinkers are all choosing urban settings or suburban churches or whatever. But what I was seeing when I looked around was a whole crop of young leaders who had intentionally chosen rural congregations and who were doing interesting work in their places and seemed like they were synthesizing this vision for rural. And it just didn't jibe with what the narrative that I had kind of heard. And I was kind of doing some of that work myself. I was like, what is this? I've been at rural for a little while now, and I'm trying to figure this out. And so kind of started to dig into that and do some real concrete thinking and search the scriptures to explore what would it mean to live a call, to do church in a rural place. Why is it different? How is it different? And I think I've kind of being in rural places, like it was sort of this parallel journey, right? Like as I came to love the places I served and the people I got to serve, I came to love the uniqueness of rural, and I kind of root for the underdog every time, right? And so whenever people were ragging on rural, I'm like, hey, there's a lot of good stuff going on out here, And so some of that kind of came together, and I was just, I started to do some writing, and what's been beautiful about it, from my perspective, is that God's Country, and I've got this new book coming out in the fall, but God's Country has really, it seems to like struck a chord with rural practitioners across the board, like charismatic to Catholic. And I think like that for me is kind of a beautiful thing, because it points to the fact that like not only are we facing a lot of the same challenges, but there's some of that same promise that we can sense God is calling us to. And and people are like, there's something beautiful here. There's actual possibility for fruitful ministry, and we want to dig into what that looks like. And so that's kind of where I came from, and why I'm hopeful about the future of rural ministry.
I really appreciate that. Yeah. Now, beyond the obvious reality that you have pastored in rural churches, how did you end up writing a book on the rural church?
It's kind of just, for me, digging into this idea that we got to learn to take rural on its own terms, right? And not see rural churches as kind of like failed suburban churches or something like that. Sort of, what is unique about people's relationship to place, and the way that the church plays kind of a unique role in these communities. And sort of digging into that. And I mean, of course, the other angle on that is that when you start to think about rural, you notice there are all these rural themes in the scriptures, right? I mean, that Jesus spent so much of his life in rural settings and small town settings. And, you start to kind of realize like God's always had a heart for rural, and just in a general sense, God's always got a heart to go to the edges. And rural is sometimes one of those edges, right? It's not the only one, but rural is sometimes one of those edges. And so, for me, it's like, let's dig into that. Let's do some thinking about that. Let's get into the scriptures and hear some wisdom from the church fathers on what would it look like to do this authentic ministry in place.
Yeah, I was appreciate the way that, as Jesus and his disciples are, even though they are rural, they come from rural places, because there's a sense where they go down to Jerusalem, and that's the Jewish experience.
Yeah.
I can imagine they felt some of that same kind of tension we feel in a modern sense of, we go to the big city a few times a year, and even like in the, what good has ever come out of Nazareth? It's like, well, obviously there were some people who had those thoughts 2,000 years ago too, that but there was good stuff going on in Nazareth, even then. So Yeah, I love the way you talk about place in the book. I think that's really, we've talked to other people about that, how important place ends up being for people in rural settings. Can you elaborate a little bit about that? Talk a little bit more about place and how it and understanding your particular context matters in rural settings.
Yeah, and in one way, this kind of applies across the board. Like wherever you're at, like urban, suburban, place matters. You got to pay attention to the context of where you're doing ministry. I mean, that's sort of ministry 101 in one way. But like I think place plays out in a really important and unique way in rural communities, because so much of our identity in rural places is tied or rooted to that sense of place. Like we are who we are because of this place. We are interconnected and to one another and rooted into this place. And that's this really powerful sense of belonging in place is attached to a rural identity. And I think that's kind of what part of what makes it unique, and part of what we got to pay attention to, because we can sometimes get lost in the weeds of like what is rural by the numbers and look at like the census definition or the USDA definition or whatever, and some of that can give us some helpful clues. But more importantly, it's this sense that we are a people in this place. Back in before the 1920s, when there's kind of a shift in the United States where more people ended up living in urban areas than in rural. Rural really just was a synonym for local. But I think now what makes rural kind of like what sets rural apart when you compare it to a modern city is that deep rooted sense of place. And for me, like that's kind of part of what our authentic ministry in rural churches and rural communities unfolds from, because that calls us to then like really see our place and really be present in our place and really like listen to the stories of our place. And I think to then have a sense of affront and kind of at the injustice of ways that some of the narratives circulating in our broader North American culture have distorted the beauty of rural. I mean, I think one of those that's kind of an easy one is like the narrative of rural decline that's always out there. Like everything in rural is just falling apart. Well, that's not the case. There are places like that, but there's a lot of life in rural communities. Or here we are. We're in an election year again, right? And the way that there are certain forces that want to kind of blame rural people for whatever they think is wrong with the electoral process or the Senate or the House of Representatives or whatever, right? And it's like that those are often very misconstrued, both in their analysis of where rural people are coming from and kind of even just the structural question. So kind of not to get into the weeds of that stuff either, but just to say like there are those narratives out there that distort the authenticity of rural experience. And I think as pastors and practitioners, we come into that and can really learn to see the reality of where we are.
Yeah, certainly. It is important to that people in rural situations, and again, as someone who sort of grew up in relatively rural area as well, and I'm sure this happens for people in suburban and urban areas too, right? Like you don't fit the caricature of who you are in real life, and that's ministry is always, no matter what your setting is, about getting to know people and the community for what it really is.
Yeah.
And I think there's a particular importance to that in rural. Maybe, and there's a history to it maybe in rural that's a little different than in urban settings where there's this is connected. Yeah. Because it's true in rural places too that turnover in population is much higher than it certainly was a few generations ago. But it's still there is still a community memory that's probably longer than it is in most urban or suburban areas, and you have to get to know that. Even if a lot of the people in your own community don't know it themselves, it still informs. I was saying that about church. Church history matters, and your local church history matters. Not because even everybody at your church knows what it is, but it still informs so much often of what happens in your church. So,
all these impressions.
Exactly. So, I think that's just so important when it comes to, getting to why that matters, why place matters, and things like that. So, Kathleen, you got a question?
Yes. You talked about acedia and that it's a particular danger for pastors in rural areas. First, what do you mean by that? And why can it be particularly problematic for pastors in rural areas?
Yeah, thanks for that question. This is really important because every time I've talked about acedia with pastors, they're all kind of saying like that. That's what I have always experienced, and I didn't have the word for it. And acedia is an ancient word. It's one of the 7 deadly sins. Sometimes get translated as sloth, but it's not about being lazy. It's at its root, acedia is failing to take joy in God. So it would be different from like clinical depression, although there might be some parallels, and it'd be different than laziness or something like that. It's this kind of blah feeling. It's was called the noonday demon, very famously by some of the desert fathers, because it was in the afternoon when they were just getting beat by the sun out in the desert that they're saying, "What am I doing here? Right? Does any of this matter?" And that's kind of at its heart, like this sense that there none of what I'm doing matters, and failing to take joy in the God who has called us to this place and the God who is doing something in and through us. And I think it's particularly poignant for rural pastors, because rural places are thin places for the abyss in some ways, right? Like there are times where you put in the same amount of work on your sermon as you would for a large congregation in another setting, and then you're like, oh, everybody's traveling this weekend, and 5 people show up, right? So, like you could kind of say like, does any of this matter, right? And this is
never had a Sunday like that
way. Right. Yeah, I mean, I remember one time all the family, these blocks of families are traveling, and my little son was passing the offering plate, and there was $1. So he goes, "Oh man!" But so you have these experiences where you kind of wonder if anything matters, and so and you can also fall into this kind of isolation. Like that's a real risk for rural pastors. I think we're more awake to how dangerous that is. And there have been networks that have been born, even just in the last couple of years, to like connect people, and some different kind of projects experimenting with how do you get people together. If you come from a strong denominational tradition, you've probably got a lot of that networking built in, and that's one of the positives of denominations. But I think it's that combination of like a sense of futility and sometimes not seeing the fruit, although not always. There's certainly fruit in rural areas, and then that isolation that can make rural one of those real like heart stabbers. And so what we have to this is part of how we have to the seed of it also provides, in the seed, God also provides the grace of redemption. And so when you learn to see the unique beauty of rural, right, and both the moral and the physical beauty, then you can start to kind of have little clues to the what the footpath out of acedia might be, and notice where God is showing up and where God is pulling you out. And so, some of that I think is the learning to cultivate our own sense of rightness in place helps us to counteract some of that acedia.
Yeah, that's very helpful. And definitely something I just reading it, and we have a friend actually who uses who loves the Desert Fathers, who talks about acedia a lot, just sort of randomly, and it struck me. But and even though I've had conversations several times with him about that, the chapter in the book really just kind of helped me think it is a particular, I think, potential malaise, and we feel very committed to like long-term ministry as well, at least in what God has called us to specifically here in Vermont. And I think it's also a struggle in that sense as well, in that you find this place where you just kind of are like, well, we've been doing this a long time, and there's been the things to celebrate and things that haven't gone as well, and it's easy to kind of get just into a sense you're just kind of going through the motions and not really living the grace and the life that God has for you and for your community. So good reminder, and well worth as one of the chapters that really just hit me very strongly. So okay, you talk about the need to watch, and I like the way you think about the idea of watching in all contexts, but especially in rural contexts as a spiritual discipline. How do we learn to watch, and what might appear how do we learn to watch what might appear to be insignificant things happening in our rural churches? And
Yeah, watching for sure is a spiritual discipline, and it's a Christian discipline, right? Like kind of watching and waiting and being attentive to what God is doing in us and in a place. And but in rural, it takes on a special importance because I think often we show up in rural places and we're operating under some of those false narratives that I was alluding to earlier, and we're primed to see need, and we're primed to see problems, but can we also learn to see the beauty of the place? And that to really watch, that's an act of love, right? It's paying attention to a person who's in front of us, is paying attention to a place that is in front of us. And so like that's kind of like that primal act, I think, of just like, are we actually present to this person and to this place? Are we actually here? And there's so much in our society, that mitigates against that and tries to get our minds to be somewhere other than where we are in this moment. And so kind of just practicing that discipline, it's like the more we do it, the more we mature just as Christians, but also as leaders. And what flows out of that? Well, I mean, I think some of the maybe all too obvious responses of celebrating the little things, right? You start to notice like, hey, this is here's something wonderful, right? Like celebrate that about our place, about the church, whatever's going on, and I think be faithful in the little things too. Just recognizing that like it's not all up to us, that God has placed us here. We are to be faithful in doing the job He has given us, but we don't have to kind of engineer a community turnaround or engineer even a church turnaround. Like we have to do our best with what and who is here, and maybe kind of be faithful or patient with the little things too. That it can be really easy to get stuck on the negative aspects of church or about place, and kind of just be patient with them too, and say like, look, everything might not be going like you would like it to go, but there are centuries deep forces that are at work here, and people are, drug along by those currents in ways that are beyond their personal decisions. Right? It's not because the congregation necessarily made an unfaithful choice a generation ago that got into this place. Like things happen, right? Like and so kind of having some patience with just where things are at. All that really seems like it flows from that basic act of watching, right? That act of love.
I like how you talked about the being patient, because I think we are trained to fix all the things. And as pastors, we're not always called to fix all the things. Sometimes we're just supposed to sit and walk through things, even hard things with our church families. And so I think I really like that patience.
Yeah. Well, what's really been on my mind lately, I've been thinking about the words that Simeon gave, those prophetic words to Mary, the mother of Jesus. And she says, he takes little baby Jesus in his arms and blesses him and prophesies over him and says, and you too, Mary, you are going to have a sword that will pierce your own soul. And I think there's something to that for us right now in the rural church, that God needs leaders who have a sword in their heart right now, a sword in their soul. I mean, I think people are willing to really be with places and to bleed a little bit. And I want to be kind of cautious with that, but I think like we're kind of at this moment where we got to be willing to have that long suffering love for people in place.
Yeah, it's amazing how it takes how the time investment, and this is true anywhere with people, right? The layers you pull back, the more time you get to spend with people, and the more that you that it's genuine, that you want to get to know them, and not just that they're. We're going to talk about this a little bit, but how people are not projects; they are people, and but how important that is, and the time that comes. We still, again, 14 years here, we find out stuff about some of the people who've been here the whole time we've been here. All the time, and you're just like, oh, there's another, onion's a way overused metaphor, but it's true in this fact. You're peeling off another layer, and in many ways the same thing for us, right? The more they get to know us too, the more they kind of see who God is created us to be, and hopefully the authentic nature that's there, and even the times when maybe it's when they also see through the parts of us that maybe aren't quite as authentic. That's probably a good thing for them and for us. So I think it's. That piece is just so important, and is important in many places, but it's got to be more genuine in rural places, just because it is the same people. It's the same. You're seeing them. You see them in church, but you see them outside of church as well. Even the people you don't see in church, because you see them again and again, things like that. So.
We appreciated your insight about knowing that you could give relationships the time and space to grow when it comes to sharing the gospel in our rural communities. Can you talk about a little bit about how being patient with people can help our interactions with them go from feeling like sales pitches to being in relationship with them?
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, I kind of just resonate with what Chris was just saying a little bit ago too about, it takes time to build those relationships. And so you're building equity in the community. People know who we are, whether we think they do or not. Right. And so we're kind of just being, this can drive people crazy, but we're being observed. Right. And so like you just have to spend some time in a place and kind of build that basis from which to do ministry. But part of it is just the simple fact that very often you bump into people more than once in a way that you might not expect to in an urban area. I mean, I just went this weekend. My wife and I were at a birthday party for a lady that used to live in our neighborhood, and we got to know her and her husband after I was just playing in the backyard with my kids, and then her grandkids were over. And so it's like one thing led to another, right? And it was just it was a natural progression of getting to know this family. And they ended up connecting with our church. And that wouldn't have happened if I would have just gone and knocked on her door and kind of like said, hey, we invite you to church, or hey, like I want to share the gospel with you or something like that. It took that building of trust and relationship. Although I have knocked on doors, and that has worked out for me at least on one occasion. But it's worked out in that after knocking on the family's door, we bumped into them at other community events and like kind of had a bunch of other points of contact, right? So it wasn't this one-off thing. So like I think that's kind of like one of the beautiful things, and kind of like you can. I'm not a patient person, but like I've been trying to learn patience with building relationships with people, because some of it's theological. God loves them more than we do, and God will continue to be at work in their lives in ways that we're not ever going to be aware of. But also just the practical thing of like, you're going to see them at a kid's event at school, and you're going to show up, if you got a coffee shop, you might bump into them there, or you'll see them at the gas station or whatever. You'll just keep seeing people. And there can be those multiple points of contact where you start to build something over time. And you got to know when the door's open. Sometimes it's like, it is now, speak now, don't drop it now. And I've been there. I have regret about times where I did not speak up when it was that kind of key moment for somebody to share the good news of Jesus. But so often, like it's that kind of like unhurried presence with people, not doing anything out of the ordinary, just kind of being in the community and caring about the community just by the fact that you live there, right? Just by the fact that you're invested in it in whatever ways that you are.
Yeah. I was going to say last night, Chris got home at, I think 9 because he was coaching a baseball game. And, the time invested, even though they went for ice cream last night, and I'm not sure Chris was super excited about going for ice cream, but it
good
gives
that we
more
went, though. Really good. We did not have a conversation where I got a chance to share the gospel in its fullness, but did have a deeper conversation with a couple of guys who I just get to see all the time at baseball for the first time in a long time, waiting in line for ice cream. That was really good. You just have to learn to appreciate stuff like that. I mean, in rural settings, you just have to learn to appreciate that stuff. And it's beautiful. It really is beautiful.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to. It's not something you have to really work at once you experience some of it over time. It's just beautiful, and you get home and you think, well, I could have gotten home half an hour earlier if I had convinced my son not to go for ice cream. But it was really good. We went, and it was beautiful, and the things that happened. Yeah.
Yeah. Amen.
So in the chapter on working the edges, and I love the analogy about barbed wire, even though there's not a ton of barbed wire in Vermont, definitely more in the Midwest. But although there are places where you're running into barbed wire, but you talked a lot about church and community boundaries. How as churches can we recognize what our boundaries are, which I think is really important, and then how do we help people get through those boundaries into our communities?
Yeah. Well, and I guess we should just kind of clarify that. Like for me, it's not that we don't have boundaries. We have theological boundaries. Like there are things that we believe, right? Like, and I know that's not what you were saying either, but like we have we have that center, we have those boundaries, but kind of like the boundaries of relationship, right? Like that's what I'm really getting at. And this idea that in our communities, there's what I talk about it as structure, kind of like ways that these relationships hold together across time in a place. And it's people are bound together by blood, by ties of friendship. And I think one of the wonderful things about rural communities is that they are often rich in belonging. And so people have those generational ties that go way back. We kind of we know one another and are known by others. We trust people, or we don't, right? Like there's like all these interwoven ties of friendship and enemies and frenemies, right? But you know, one of the things I think we kind of come to realize, especially if we're coming from outside, which often pastors are, is that richness of belonging is not open to everybody. And I think, you know, just like monetary wealth can be used to wall us off from those who are different from us or who are in need, and can sometimes kind of blind us because we just don't even see some of the need because, you know, you're driving through, you're kept from some of that. Just as monetary wealth can do that, this wealth of belonging can also do that. And people don't realize often like how hard it can be to break into some of the community structure in rural communities. And if we come in as outsiders, as pastors, and sometimes, of course, there are really effective pastors who are from that church and that community. They have their own set of issues to work through, right? You know, and see Jesus' words about prophets and no honor in their own country. Right? But when you come in as an outsider, you know, you realize that family is a beautiful thing, but can also be a dangerous word in churches. And I think especially in rural churches like that what binds us together can also be what excludes. And it's not even that it's an intentional thing, but it's just that people aren't aware, kind of don't have their eyes attuned to new folks in town in the ways that they might like to connect as well. You know, I think for leadership within rural churches, part of it's building that equity. I think part of it's just kind of like saying, it's being there over time. It's just kind of maybe developing a little bit of a thick skin to that. I mean, one pastor I know really well was talking about how in an intense situation that he was involved in his church, that a key leader said to him, "It's our church." You know, it's sort of like, well, you know, there's some snarky answers that you might want to give to that. It's like, God might like to have a word about whose church it is, but you know, just that sense of like, are you one of us or are you not? And you know, like that's what we sometimes can struggle with. And I think part of it for us is keeping a real biblical vision of what the church is. I mean, the scriptures talk about church as the people of God, but like it's a disruptive people of God, right? It's not just about those old Abrahamic family ties. The new branches have been grafted in. That's part of the deep story of who we are as the people of God. And so kind of reminding people of like, that means here and now as well, right? Like you don't get to be part of the church just because you've got like relatives buried in the cemetery. Like this is for everybody. And especially when you've got a community that begins to experience newcomers moving in. And a lot of rural communities are growing, contra some of the narratives that are out there. When you have new people moving in, I think part of what we do as leaders, and we can be attentive to this if we come as outsiders, to say like, how do we just look at that structure and draw a little opening on it for people to come through, or draw a little side area here for people to connect. You know, I talked to some church planters in rural Minnesota at one point, and they planted a church in this community that had that real deep structure, lots of Lutheran ties, a lot of Catholic ties. And you know, if you want from the outside, you might think like, oh, it's kind of, they got it covered, right? Like there's this deep history of faith in this community, but their church really took off because from my perspective, what they were able to do was reach folks that were on, you know, some kind of a margin, people for whom the structure, for whatever reason, was not working. And so those people were able to find a sense of belonging in this new church. And I think there's often pockets of that in our rural communities, and kind of one of the fruits that we can reach for as leaders is to say, like, where are people not belonging, and how can we tap into that and make the church a place that is hospitable for them. And I don't mean that in like a really simplistic way of like, well, we just got to like bring in the smoke machine or something like that, but like where you can really build community for folks that might not have a kind of a natural fit within our church structures.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've come to notice in our community, people like to move here. I mean, we're in sort of a ski town, so people sometimes retire here and things like that. And they often come from more urban areas to our area when they move here. And I think sometimes for rural people, particularly people who've lived in like this rural area or in a particular rural area for a long time, it's kind of intimidating. They're like, well, they're skeptical of the person because that's just kind of the rural wondering about what's really going on there in those suburban and urban areas. But the reality is, for the most part, if they move to your community, they move there because people mostly live in rural places because they want to. It's easier in many ways to live in urban or suburban areas. And as that's become, as people do move into rural communities, understanding that, and that for the most part, they may not. Obviously, there's a lot of things about the community they're not going to understand right when they first move in. Just like we wouldn't understand moving necessarily to a suburban area right away, but they are looking for the opportunities to be incorporated into that. And I think that's what you're saying there with, if you can provide some of that place for them where they can, where you can kind of bring them into the church, to the community in that regard, but also to the wider community through the church too, I think can be really helpful. So I think there's a real opportunity for a lot of rural communities. And of course, as the people of God in a community, we should be the ones when outsiders come into our community, we should be the people building those bridges, hopefully we are. I know there are places where that doesn't happen. So, as churches, that should be our goal though, is that we're the place where people are connected to their community, because we are connected. That's what, Jesus is connecting us to God, and we need to connect people to God as well and to other people as well. So.
And I think sometimes it can be as simple as like new people moving to town and knowing, where do I go to the doctor, or where, like, it doesn't have to be anything huge. I spend a fair amount of time like answering those questions because I'm a safe person to ask, and I'm a text away, like, and I try to do that because I care about those people, and that's like one way that you can build your relationship pretty quickly, is by being that person that you can answer those questions. Like, how does it work when you go to the dump? Like, we have to do compost. And it's pretty confusing to try to figure out the whole compost recycling, like, oh, you have to get tickets. Where do you go get the tickets in order to pay for your trash? I mean, and I don't do the trash. Chris does all the trash and recycling and compost, but like, I know enough that I can explain it to someone else. And I also know, the person at the dump, I know who he is. He knows us. When my dad brought trash and didn't have the ticket, Steve was like, oh, well, we'll worry about that next time Chris comes, like that's part of living this life, and those relationships and helping build those relationships in really simple ways, I think goes a long way.
And
I love that. I mean, sometimes rural becomes like, I know a guy writ large, it's like everything is I know a guy. And so sometimes we're that kind of cultural explainer. We're the we build that bridge and help people know that guy too.
And it's good too when we can be that for somebody else too, to an extent. I mean, that takes time in a community, but when you get to a point where somebody in town will be like, hey, I've been seeing this new person around, like, what are you thinking? You can be like, hey, well, actually, one, I've been trying to get to know people in the town. So this is a good example to set. And then two, this is where they're from. And I mean, how much, it's just some of those little ways where you can really just break down some of those barriers that it takes between community and new people. And again, our context can be particularly problematic in that, because anytime ski areas or ski towns are like that, in that whenever there's people who often come in with significantly more means than the people who live here, there is barrier there. And yet there's a necessity for the relationship between people there. So so we do a lot of work in that regard, but just really, there's a lot of opportunities to find connections for ministry in those spots. Don't shy away from that would be my advice.
Yeah, it's fruitful.
Well, and I think that goes along with our what we were referring to earlier is people are not projects, and that we don't want to turn like I always talk about the like pastor agenda with our people. Like sometimes it's hard for me to invite people to church because it feels like they think I have an agenda. And so the thing that I try to do is to be a friend to them and spend a lot of time being a friend and checking in on them and that kind of thing. And then when someone else invites them to church, it's beautiful because they already have like 2 points of contact in that relationship. And I love that.
Yeah, that's so great. I have a little rule, like I never invite anyone to church on the first encounter because like it just seems right away like, oh, well, you're a mercenary. We know you're just you're paid to do this and you don't actually care about me.
And that adage that you people have to know you care about it before they'll open up to you is definitely more very true in a rural setting. A lot of times, that there is a skepticism that comes. Again, especially as you first move in as an outsider, even as I think as pastors, often we are. When you come into a community, you're a person who's been somewhat invited into the community a lot of times or something like that, which does give you a leg up on someone who just shows up. But it's still you have to put that time into, and it doesn't have to be a long time, but it just has to be. People have to start to understand. Oh, they really do care about what's happening here. They care about what God's up to. If certainly inside the church and outside the church, that they recognize you care about what happens in the community.
Well, you talked about that you have a new book that's coming out later this year, Flyover Church. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, I'm so excited about this new book. In one way, it's kind of everything I've learned since God's Country, which is a lot. But I think what I'm trying to do is follow the Gospel of Mark and show how Jesus is at work in his ministry, and that ministry then continues. I mean, there's ways that Mark invites us into that continued ministry of Jesus among us, and say, what does that look like in rural places? Because I think we're at a really exciting time in rural, and so there's kind of never been a better time to be a rural leader in the church in North America. But there's also tough stuff, and we want to focus on the fact that Jesus was here first and that he continues to be at work through us. So that's what I'm really doing in Flyover Church, is kind of zeroing in on that, on his presence, and saying, what does that look like? Let's pull some, let's glean some lessons. Let's glean some truth from different episodes in the Gospel of Mark and how that plays out in the particularities of rural places.
Well, that sounds really good, and I'm excited. Like I said, I'm excited to read the book. I'm looking forward to it. You say it comes out in the fall?
Yeah, it comes out August 13th. Right. So we're starting to count the days.
Well, that's good.
Wow, that's exciting.
That is exciting.
Yeah. So thanks for that. Is there anything that we didn't cover today that you think is important for our listeners to hear?
I just want to say to any rural leaders and pastors, be encouraged. God is good, and it is good to do work in rural places. And I think we've been entering in the last few years into a kind of a renewed awareness of the dignity and the importance of rural church. And I wonder might God be opening a new chapter now? Might God be doing a new thing in rural places? And so we have the privilege of being a part of that. And so be encouraged.
Thanks so much, Brad.
Rural Renewal Podcast is brought to you by Fresh Expressions and the Ascent Movement. Fresh Expressions is a worldwide movement of everyday missionaries who want to see churches thrive in the places we live, eat, work, and play by leveraging the creativity and endurance of the inherited church. To learn a simple 5-phase process for starting a new expression of church that works in small towns, big cities, and everywhere in between, go to freshexpressions.com/how-to-start.
To connect with this podcast, you can email us at podcasts@freshexpressions.com. Rural Renewal Podcast is hosted by Kathleen Blackie and Chris Blackie. It's edited by Joel Limbowen and produced by Kathleen Blackie and Chris Morton. Our senior director is Dr. Christopher Becker.
If you have learned something or been encouraged by this podcast, please help us spread the word. You can give us a review on Apple Music or Spotify and share this episode on social media.
Let us end with this prayer for town and rural area from the Book of Common Prayer. Lord Christ, when you came among us, you proclaimed the kingdom of God in villages, towns, and lonely places. Grant that your presence and power may be known throughout this land. Have mercy upon all of us who live and work in rural areas, and grant that all the people may give thanks to you for food and drink and all other bodily necessities of life. Grant those who labor to produce them, and honor the land and water from which these good things come. All this we ask in your holy name. Amen.